The train doors opened to a sound the women had never heard before, dry wind sweeping across endless plains. For thousands of miles they had crossed oceans and rails under guard, first in silence, then in disbelief, and finally in a kind of numb surrender. But nothing prepared them for the desolate warmth of Texas, a land so wide the horizon itself seemed to tremble in the heat. It was September 1944, and the Second World War was still tearing Europe apart. But here in the American Southwest, the front lines felt like another planet. The air held the scent of dust mesquite and distant cattle herds. Enter the 200 German women stepping off the train, many of them nurses, auxiliaries, and civilian workers, swept up by Allied arrests in France. It felt impossibly foreign. One of them, Lieslot Weber, 23 years old, daughter of a Munich carpenter, paused at the foot of the wooden steps. Her boots hit the Texas ground for the first time, sinking slightly into a crust of ochre soil. She squinted toward the sun, a glaring white disk that seemed ready to burn straight through her eyelids. Around her the women murmured quietly, "Es ist so halb. It's so hot. Where are we? What is this place? A U.S. Army sergeant pointed them toward a line of military trucks. His tone was firm but not cruel. "Welcome to Camp Hearn, Texas. Move along, ladies. Stay in formation." Camp Hearn was one of more than 40 major POW camps scattered across the United States. Most held German soldiers captured in North Africa or in France. But the war had created chaos, and amidst collapsing front lines and vast Allied sweeps, some German women army nurses, Red Cross workers, clerks from abandoned headquarters were detained and processed as POW. For the Americans, they were simply another category to manage. For the women, this was exile. As the trucks rumbled away from the rail siding, Lieslot watched miles of open rangeland flow, past sun-soaked fields, distant windmills, fences, stretching into eternity. She felt weightless, suspended between worlds, the Europe she had lost and this strange land of dust and sky. It was quiet inside the truck. Beside her, Annalise, a timid 19-year-old who had served as a field hospital assistant near Keene, clutched her bag as if it might float away. "Do you think they will put us to work?" Annalise whispered. "Yes," Lieslot answered softly. "I think that's the point." She didn't know how right she was. When the convoy approached the outskirts of Camp Hearn, the women saw rows of low wooden barracks neatly spaced behind fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers rose at each corner, plain, practical, unmistakably American in their construction. It didn't look like a European prison. It looked like a frontier outpost. Cattle grazed in a neighboring pasture, unfazed by the trucks. A cowboy on horseback, an actual cowboy, not a storybook caricature, watched the convoy pass, hat tilted low over his brow, his horse shifting lazily beneath him. The women murmured again, "Ein Cowboy are those cattle. Where have they brought us?" The strangeness of it was overwhelming. Inside the camp, the atmosphere surprised them even more. The guards were disciplined but polite. They distributed water canteens. They escorted the women to assigned barracks, spot and clean, with rows of bunks. And though the fences loomed overhead, the camp carried an unexpected air of routine rather than fear. For Lieslot it was unsettling. Kindness in captivity always is. That evening, after intake processing, she stepped outside into the cooling air. The Texas sky had deepened to a dark crystalline blue. Stars appeared one by one like scattered lanterns across a dome, higher than any sky she had known in Europe. Voices drifted from nearby barracks, women laughing nervously at their first American meal, others writing letters that would take months to reach home. From beyond the fence came different sounds: the gentle lowing of cattle, the rhythmic creak of a windmill pumping water, and faint guitar music drifting from the ranch houses bordering the camp. Music unlike anything she had heard on German radios before. Slow wandering, touched with melancholy and dust. The song rose and fell with the wind carried across the open land, as though the plains themselves were singing. Lyslot found herself standing still listening. She didn't know it yet, but that music would shape her future more than any uniformed guard or barbed wire fence. Texas was not Europe, and life here, despite the war, did not follow the rules she knew. Within weeks, American ranchers would request volunteer labor from the camp. Cotton fields needed hands, cattle drives needed cooks. The army approved it. Supervised work was better than idleness, and that is how the unimaginable would begin. POW and cowboys side by side, German women and American ranch families sharing wagons, tools, and long hours under the same sun. It would start as necessity, then as curiosity, then something deeper. But on that first night, under that vast Texas sky, Lyslot Weber knew none of that. She only knew she was far from home in a land that felt like a dream half-written. She exhaled the desert wind brushing her face. Somewhere outside the fence, the guitar fell silent. And in the quiet that followed, she felt the first small shift in her heart, the faintest realization that Texas, for all its strangeness, was not hostile. That it breathed slowly, openly, like a giant animal unbothered by war. Years later she would say, "That was the night I realized America was not an enemy, just a different world." And for many of the women at Camp Hearn, that night was the beginning of a journey. No one could have predicted a journey that would end with choices that defied borders, uniforms, and the gravity of war itself. The American home front was a paradox, especially in places like Texas. By late 1944, the United States had mobilized millions of men across Europe and the Pacific, yet the country itself remained untouched by bombers or invasion. Daily life continued. People woke to roosters, tended cattle, drove to church, and gathered for Sunday dinners. Even in wartime, Texas felt its own steady rhythm. But the war created a problem that no government planner had fully anticipated. Farm hands were gone drafted, ranch boys were gone deployed, cotton fields lay unattended, cattle needed driving, fencing, branding. In a state vast enough to swallow entire nations, labor shortages could cripple entire counties. And so reluctantly at first, the War Department approved the use of German POW labor. By 1944, more than 400 zero German prisoners, mostly men, were housed across the United States. And in rare cases like Camp Hearn, a smaller number of German women had been processed due to the chaos of Allied advances in France. The Geneva Conventions allowed labor under humane conditions, and Texas ranchers needed hands. But the rules were strict. Prisoners were never to be armed, guards would accompany them, contact with civilians was to be minimal, romantic or personal relationships were forbidden. On paper, it all seemed controlled. But paper does not account for life. A new kind of war life inside Camp Hearn settled into routine. The women attended English classes, participated in Red Cross recreation hours, and adapted to American food, beans, cornbread, endless coffee. They stitched uniforms, sorted medical supplies, worked in camp kitchens. But the prison fences didn't change the reality outside them. Texas had more land than labor. And as winter yielded to spring, ranchers began filing formal requests to the camp commander. Volunteers, only the army insisted. The lists filled quickly. Lyslot Weber volunteered partly out of necessity, partly out of restlessness. She preferred hard work to sitting in a barracks thinking about Munich under fire. She joined a labor unit assigned to small ranches near Hearn, washing tools, helping prepare meals during cattle roundups, sorting feed under guard supervision. The first day outside the camp, the landscape stunned her again. Dry grasslands stretched like a faded quilt, wide blue sky, windmills, hawks circling above. Nothing in Germany resembled this. The women rode in a flatbed farm truck guarded by two calm but watchful MP. As they approached a cattle gate, they saw local ranchers waiting, hats pulled low, shirts, sun-bleached hands scarred by work. The first meetings were awkward. German accents collided with Texan drawls. Smiles were hesitant, gazes cautious, but in the world of cattle and cotton work was a universal language. Lyslot shoveled grain beside a rancher's wife, Martha Caldwell, a sturdy woman with silver hair coiled under a kerchief. The older woman noticed Lyslot struggling with the dust. "You'll get used to it," Martha said gently. "Texas dust gets in your bones." Lyslot managed a small smile. "I think it already has." By noon the wind kicked up, carrying sand and the smell of sagebrush. The ranchers offered water shade and lunch, thick sandwiches, peaches from jars, and iced tea, so cold the jars sweated in the heat. Prisoners and civilians sat apart, supervised and silent. But silence is not a wall, not in a place as wide as Texas. By the second week, greetings grew warmer. By the third, conversations began brief, cautious, but human. And by the fourth, the women realized something extraordinary. Not one local treated them with hatred. Suspicion, yes. Curiosity, naturally, but not hatred. To Texans the war was far away, but neighbors, anyone working on their land, were close. The war returns in letters inside the barracks evenings brought a different reality. Each woman waited for letters from home, long delayed, censored, often heartbreaking. One letter to Annalise described bombed neighborhoods in Hamburg. Another told a woman named Clara that her brother was missing on the Eastern Front. Lyslot received news that her father's workshop had burned. Firestorms had no mercy even for carpenters. Some women cried quietly into their blankets. Others stared at the ceiling, silent, hollowed by worry. The guards knew not to interrupt. In those moments, Texas felt impossibly safe, almost shamefully so. A place where cattle slept peacefully while entire German cities burned in the night. Yet this contrast, war in Europe, peace in America, would become the strange bridge between the prisoners and the Texans. For the locals, the battlefield was distant. For the prisoners, the battlefield was everything. Their suffering made them real in the eyes of the ranch families, not as enemies but as daughters, sisters, women, far from home. A fence that was only a border on paper one afternoon in April 1945, while sorting equipment under a barn awning, Lyslot saw a cowboy approach, tall, sun-browned, perhaps 25 years old. A rope hung from his shoulder, his boots marked with dried mud. He removed his hat politely. "Afternoon, ma'am." The guard nodded stiffly, allowing brief conversation. It was permitted as long as it remained harmless. The cowboy smiled, shy, quiet. "I'm Caleb Turner," he said. "My folks run the North Pasture. You're working up here today." Lyslot nodded. "We are cleaning and repairing the feed bins. You're doing fine work," he said. "My ma appreciates it." His eyes held a kind sincerity she had not seen since leaving home. She struggled to find an English reply. "Thank you, we try." Caleb tipped his hat again, then returned to his horse. It was an interaction of mere seconds, yet it lingered in her mind all night. A cowboy speaking gently to a German prisoner. War had never felt so far away. An unspoken change by summer, something subtle had shifted. The prisoners were no longer novelties, they were familiar faces. Lyslot, who worked hard and said little. Annalise, who laughed nervously but sang in a beautiful voice. Clara, who had learned to braid rope better than some ranch hands. The Texans had changed too. War news from Europe, Hitler's suicide, the surrender in May reached them with relief, not vengeance. The women were now prisoners from a defeated nation, but defeat did not look like hatred. It looked like tiredness. It looked like loss. It looked like young women waiting for ships that would someday return them to a home in ruins. And for many Texans, hospitality was a reflex, not a choice. If a stranger was hungry, you fed them. If someone worked on your land, you thanked them. And if they were suffering, you offered comfort. These small acts, innocent, humane, were the seeds of the impossible. The seeds of the story this chapter leads toward, the story of German POW women and the men of the Texas plains who would one day stand on either side of a fence and realize they no longer felt like strangers. The Texas summer arrived not with a gradual warming, but with a sudden, unforgiving blaze. By June 1945, the fields shimmered in heat fence posts cracked in the sun, and the air buzzed with cicadas that seemed to echo across the plains like distant engines. For the German women at Camp Hirn it was a season of contradictions. The war in Europe had ended, yet they remained prisoners. Victory had been declared, yet home felt further away than ever. The camp officers explained the delay as administrative processing. Surrender had not magically produced ships nor cleared the seas of mines. Repatriation would take months, perhaps a year. Until then, life continued under the same fences, the same towers, the same rules. But something in Liselott Weber had begun to change. She had grown used to the sound of American boots on gravel, the drawl of Texan speech, the rhythm of ranch work that filled her days outside the camp. Her English had improved quickly. She spoke softly, precisely choosing words with care. She carried herself with a calm presence that ranch families respected. And though she rarely laughed the sternness that had hardened her in wartime, Munich had begun to soften. And then there was Caleb Turner. He appeared without warning, always quietly, often at the edge of her vision, checking fences, repairing barn doors, tightening ropes. He never intruded, never approached without cause. Texas code dictated that a cowboy respected distances, but it was always clear when he was nearby. He moved with a kind of deliberate steadiness, as though nothing, not war, not heat, not the vastness of the plains could hurry him. Liselott noticed him before she admitted it to herself. The first conversation that was more than words one morning in late June. Liselott worked alone inside a ramshackle toolshed on the Turner Ranch, mending worn canvas sacks. The guard outside leaned against a fence post, fanning himself with a newspaper. The cicadas were relentless. The shed door creaked. Caleb stepped in holding a bucket of nails. "Morning," he said gently. "Hope the heat ain't too rough on you." Liselott wiped sweat from her brow. "It is. Different from Germany," he chuckled softly. "Different from anywhere, I'd wager." She glanced at the bucket. "More repairs." "Always. The land don't stop for war." He placed the bucket down and hesitated, as though choosing his next words carefully. "You do good work," he said. "My ma says you're quicker with a needle than most cowhands with a knife." Liselott felt a faint flush rise in her cheeks. Praise from a cowboy was not given lightly. "I learned to sew from my father," she said. "He made furniture, upholstery too." Caleb nodded. "A craftsman then." "I reckon you take after him." She didn't answer. Her father's shop, reduced to ash by Allied bombers, was a memory that struck like shrapnel. Caleb seemed to sense the shift. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to stir something painful." "You did not know," she whispered. Silence settled between them, not awkward, not heavy, but respectful. A kind of silence that acknowledges loss. Outside, the guard called, "Ma'am, need you to move on to the next shed in 10 minutes." Caleb replaced his hat. Before leaving, he said something simple, something she did not expect. "If you ever need a rest from work, our porch has shade. You can sit a minute before heading back. Just ask the guard." It was a small offer, a human one, but in the life of a prisoner, humanity was rare enough to feel like treasure. As he stepped out, she watched his silhouette fade into the glare. Something inside her had shifted again. A life between fences the next weeks unfolded like a slow-moving river, always the same on the surface, always changing beneath. Work details continued. The guards eased slightly. The war was over after all. The ranch families offered cold water smiles, sometimes extra fruit or bread, and Liselott found herself speaking more often with Caleb. Never alone, never unsupervised, never in a way that broke the official rules. but enough to fill the long Texas days with something she had not felt in years: presence, attention, a sense of being seen. Caleb asked about Germany, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. What was Munich like before all this? What did you do before the war took it all? She told him about narrow cobblestone streets, wooden toys in shop windows, the church bells that framed her childhood. She spoke of winters so cold the Isar River froze, of summer festivals, of evenings when her father carved wood while her mother read by lamplight. Caleb listened intently, as though carving each detail into his memory. In return, he told her about Texas, its storms, its long drought years, the nights when coyotes howled so close to the ranch house that his mother would lock the doors twice. He spoke of cattle drives that lasted 10 days, of dancing at the county fair of his brother, who had served in Italy and returned with eyes that seemed older than his years. Their stories were different yet strangely parallel, two lives shaped by war in ways neither asked for. A porch in the shade one afternoon, after hours repairing torn feed sacks, the guard allowed the labor crew a few minutes of rest before the truck returned them to the camp. Annalise and Clara sought shade beneath a pecan tree, but Lyslot found herself drifting almost unconsciously toward the Turner porch. Caleb was there drinking water from a tin cup. He rose when he saw her approach. Texans were raised that way. "You look worn clean through," he said. "I am," she replied truthfully. He motioned to a wooden chair. "Sit. The sun can't reach you here." She hesitated, glancing toward the guard. He nodded approval. Caleb sat on the step, not beside her, but nearby, respecting distance, though his presence felt close in the warm air. They spoke quietly, about the weather, about work, about nothing and about everything. And then, without intention, Caleb asked the question that would change everything. "What will you do when they send you home?" Lyslot opened her mouth, but no words came. Germany was rubble. Her father's shop was gone. Her family scattered, the future a void. "I do not know," she whispered. Caleb studied her face carefully, his expression softening. "Well," he said after a long pause, "if you ever find yourself with nowhere to go. Texas has a way of making room." It was not a proposal, not a declaration, but it was something real, an opening, a possibility, a future not defined by war. And as the truck arrived to return the women to Camp Hearn, Lyslot realized something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Hope not for survival, but for life. The summer light in Texas lasts long into the evening. It lingers like a promise over the plains, gold on the grass, orange on the barn roofs, pink across the clouds, before surrendering to the deep blue of night. For the prisoners of Camp Hearn, these long evenings were a strange gift. They softened the edges of captivity. They made the fences seem smaller. They made the world outside the wire feel closer than it should have. But for Lyslot Weber, the evening of July 12, 1945, would mark the beginning of a conflict far deeper than anything the war had left behind. The day had begun like any other. A labor detail to the Turner Ranch, a steady sun, the sound of cicadas pulsing like a heartbeat across the fields. Lyslot worked alongside Annalise and Clara, repairing a stretch of fence. Caleb Turner was nearby, guiding ranch hands as they herded cattle toward a shaded pasture. He looked tired more than usual. His movements were heavy, deliberate, his jaw tense. Around noon, news reached the ranch from a dusty mail truck bouncing along the dirt road. A letter from the War Department for the Turner family. Caleb read it slowly, lips barely moving, then folded it in silence. Lyslot watched from a distance. Something was wrong. She felt it before she knew it, like a cold gust passing through the heat. But she could not ask. A prisoner had no right to worry. The waiting shadows hours later, as the sun dipped low, the labor crew gathered tools and prepared to return to the camp truck. The guard was distracted, talking with the ranch foreman. The other women chatted softly. That was when Caleb approached, stopping a few feet away, still keeping the cautious proper distance demanded by regulations. But propriety did not soften the pain in his eyes. "My brother," he said quietly, "you remember I told you he served in Italy." "Yes, Lyslot," replied, her voice barely audible. "He passed away, wounds from the Apennines. The letter came today." The words struck with the slow weight of a falling tree. Lyslot inhaled sharply. "I am so sorry." Caleb nodded once, jaw tightening. He was all I had left besides Ma. Silence followed, heavy, respectful. But the silence also carried another truth, one Lyslot recognized with painful clarity. She understood loss. Intimately, completely. She had seen it in her father's burned shop, in the rubble of Munich, in the empty chairs at her mother's kitchen table. She had breathed the ash of war long before she had ever smelled Texas dust. "I wish I could offer more," she said, "but I have only words." "Your words are enough," he answered. The guard called out, "Load up, ladies." Caleb tipped his hat mechanically, but his eyes rested on Lyslot for a moment longer than usual. That night back at the barracks she lay awake long after the other women slept, staring at the rafters. She felt a pull inside her, a mixture of sorrow, compassion, and something more dangerous, something she refused to name. A risk against regulations. 2 days later, when the labor detail returned to the Turner ranch, the atmosphere had changed. Martha Turner, the mother, was sitting on the porch, her eyes red from crying, but her posture strong. She nodded politely to the women as they were unloaded. "Thank you for your help today," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the grief beneath it. The women curtsied instinctively. Respect feels universal in moments of mourning. Later, while the women worked sorting feed, a sudden cloud of dust appeared on the road, another army jeep. It rolled toward the ranch yard, tires crunching over gravel. A camp officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Repatriation orders," he announced. The German women froze. "First transport leaves August 28. All eligible POW will begin pre-embarkation procedures next month." The officer spoke briskly, officially. It was the tone of a system, not a human. Then he added, "That includes this labor unit." He drove off, leaving dust and shock behind. The women exchanged glances, relief mixed with dread. To return home was to reunite with family, or to return to ruins. No one knew which, no one dared to hope too much. Lyslot felt the world shift under her feet. She would leave Texas, she would leave the ranch, she would leave Caleb. She felt no joy in this, only confusion. The conversation that should not have happened near the day's end, while carrying supplies from the barn to the truck, Lyslot found Caleb waiting near the cattle gate, hands in his pockets, shoulders stiff with unspoken tension. "Word reached town," he said. "They're sending y'all home." "Yes," she replied. His eyes drifted to the horizon. "Germany's broken. I know. You have anyone left there?" "A mother," she said softly, "if she survived the bombings." "And your father?" She hesitated. "Gone." Caleb nodded slowly, as though confirming something he already suspected. The wind shifted, warm, dry, smelling of cut hay. "What do you want, Lyslot?" He asked the question, low, careful. Prisoners were not supposed to have personal exchanges with civilians. Feelings were forbidden, affection unimaginable, but some questions ignore regulation. "I don't know," she said finally. "Germany feels like a ghost. But I do not belong here." He looked at her then fully, openly. "I don't know where you belong, but it doesn't feel right that you're being sent across an ocean to start from ashes." She exhaled shakily. "My life is not mine to choose." He stepped back as though forcing himself to maintain distance. "Just know, you'd be welcome here, if choice ever comes." She lowered her eyes. "Thank you." The guard shouted, "Load up." As she turned to leave, Caleb said one last thing, words she would carry into the night, into the weeks ahead, into the impossible crossroads she soon would face. "There are fences in this world," he said, "but not all of them are meant to keep people apart." Something forbidden begins to grow back at the camp. The women felt tension rising. Letters were written home, plans, whispered fears shared. Some looked forward to leaving America. some dreaded it. But Lyslot felt suspended, caught between duty and desire, between the nation of her birth and a land that had given her something she thought the war had stripped away forever: care, kindness, the possibility of a life not defined by rubble. Rumors spread through the barracks. Some prisoners had already married locals in other states after release. Some had returned to America after repatriation. Some had found sponsors who helped them come back legally. But such stories felt distant, impossible, dangerous, and yet Lyslot could not stop thinking of the way Caleb looked at her, not with pity, not as a prisoner, but as a woman with a future she was beginning to want, more than she dared admit. August arrived with a heat so heavy it felt like a weight on the chest. Dust rose from every step, clung to the hems of dresses, coated the canvas tents and the wooden barracks of Camp Hearn. The cicadas screamed louder than they had in June, as though trying to drown out the tension, humming quietly through the POW compound. Repatriation Day was approaching. The officers posted lists near the mess hall, each name carefully typed, each line representing a woman soon to be shipped across the Atlantic, back to a nation broken, starving, and uncertain. Lyslot Weber stared at her name on the board. Weber Lyslot, Transporter 14, departs August 28, 1945. Beside her, Annalise whispered, "I don't want to go home." And though Lyslot didn't speak it aloud, she felt the same. Home was rubble, home was doubt. Home was 1,000 unanswered questions. But Texas had become something living inside her. Yet regulations were iron, choices were illusions, and hope was a dangerous thing for a prisoner. A last day on the ranch on the morning of August 20th, the last scheduled labor detail for the women assigned to local ranches left Camp Hearn in a military truck. Dust trailed behind them like a fading memory. When they arrived at the Turner Ranch, Martha Turner was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of cold lemonade, one for the guard, one for herself. It was the first time she had not brought extras for the women too. Rules were tightening as repatriation neared, but Martha's eyes softened when they met Lyslot's. "We'll miss your hands around here," she said quietly. "You do work worth respecting." "Thank you," Lyslot replied, her voice barely steady. Caleb was near the barn coiling rope. When he saw Lyslot, he paused, not approaching but waiting. It was better that way, safer. The day's work was simple: sorting tools, stacking hay, checking feed bins. The kind of work they had done dozens of times, but every moment felt sharp and heavy with the knowledge that it would be the last. Late in the afternoon, while carrying a box of nails to the workshop, Lyslot found Caleb standing beneath the old cottonwood tree. The one behind the barn, the one whose branches cast the widest shade on the property. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. She stopped a few paces away. The guard was distracted, arguing with a ranch hand about the schedule for return. A moment, brief, fragile, opened between them. "You leave in 8 days, Caleb said, his voice low. "Yes." He looked toward the horizon, his eyes narrowed. The light filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling his face in gold and shadow. "I keep thinking," he said, "how strange it is that a war brought you here, to suffer," Lyslot said. "No," he replied softly, "to be seen." She felt her breath catch. No one had spoken to her like that since before the first bombs fell on Munich. Not as a prisoner, not as a foreigner, but as a woman. "I wish you could stay," he admitted. "It is impossible." "Not impossible," he said quietly. "Hard, yes, but not impossible." She shook her head. "I am a German POW." "You are an American. Our countries were enemies." He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that she felt the warmth of his presence. "I don't give a damn what country you came from," he said. "War's over. People survive it however they can, and sometimes," he paused, "sometimes they're meant to meet someone on the other side." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Caleb, if I stayed, I would have nothing. No right to be here. No home, no papers, no family, no future. You'd have a place," he said quietly. "Ma would welcome you, and," he swallowed, "and if you'd let me, You'd have me. She looked away, heart pounding. You say such things, she whispered, but you do not understand what it means to start life again. I do, he answered. My brother won't ever walk back through our door. Ma won't hear his laugh again. We're rebuilding too. Not from rubble like you, but from loss just the same. The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves. A single leaf drifted to the ground between them. Lyslot knelt, picked it up, held it between her fingers. Fragile, light, temporary, just like her presence here. When she stood, her voice had softened. If I stay, I will never see my mother again. Caleb's expression shifted, not disappointment, but acceptance. I know, he said, and I wouldn't ask you to choose between us. But she could feel what he didn't say. He hoped she would. A plan no one expected. A week later, on the night of August 26th, there was a commotion in the camp. A sudden arrival of officers, guards checking paperwork, baggage being inventoried. The transport ship had been moved up. Departure was now August 27th at dawn. Whispers filled the barracks. They're sending us early. They don't want trouble. They want us gone before any civilian attachments form. Lyslot felt her chest tighten. Fate was closing in. That night, unable to sleep, she stepped quietly to the small barred window near her bunk. It faced the distant fields beyond the wire. The moon hung low over the plains, lighting the grass in silver. She thought of the cottonwood tree, of Caleb's voice, of the offer she dared not accept, of the mother she might never see again, and of herself, not as a prisoner, but as a woman standing at a crossroads between two shattered worlds. The final work detail at dawn on August 27th, the truck rolled toward the Turner Ranch one final time. Not for work, there was no time for that, but to collect tools and sign off on completed tasks before the women were formally repatriated. Formalities, paper, signatures. The sun was barely risen when Lyslot stepped off the truck. Caleb was waiting. He had known they would come. He had risen before dawn. He stood tall, composed, but his eyes revealed the truth. He feared this moment. Lyslot approached cautiously, the guard watching from the truck. "This is good. Bye," she said gently. "It doesn't have to be," he replied. She closed her eyes. A tear finally escaped, tracing down her cheek. "I cannot stay," she whispered. "Not now, not like this." He nodded, throat tightening. "But promise me one thing," he said. "When you reach Germany, if you find a way, right, if you want to come back, I'll sponsor you. I'll work the land harder than ever to make it possible." She opened her eyes. "Why?" His answer was simple. "Because you changed the way I see the world." She inhaled sharply. "And you showed me that kindness still lives in it." They stood in silence, the whole world shrinking to the space between them. Then the guard called, "Time to go." Caleb stepped back. Lyslot walked toward the truck, and just before climbing aboard, she turned, lifted her hand slightly, and spoke the last words he would hear from her for a very long time. "I will try to find a way back." For weeks after the women of Camp Hearn were shipped home, the Turner Ranch felt strangely hollow. The cottonwood tree rustled the same way it always had. The wind swept across the pastures with its familiar dry whisper. The cattle bellowed in the lowlands at dusk, but there was an absence now, a quiet that had not existed before. Caleb Turner moved through his days as he always had, repairing fences, tending the herd, hauling feed. But even Martha noticed the way his eyes lingered toward the road each morning, as if expecting a truck that would never come again, as if expecting a voice carried on the wind. On the evening of September 12, 1945, a month after deportation, Caleb sat alone beneath the cottonwood tree. Dusk painted the fields with amber light. He pulled a small folded paper from his shirt pocket. The cottonwood leaf Lyslot had picked up the day they spoke their parting words. He kept it pressed inside his Bible between the pages of Exodus, a symbol of wandering, of leaving, of searching for home. He whispered into the quiet, "Did you make it back? "Did you find your mother?" The wind did not answer, but the story was far from over. In the ruins of Munich, Lieslot arrived in Germany on a cold grey morning in late September, stepping off the transport ship among thousands of returning POW. The Red Cross processed each woman, assigning ration cards and temporary shelter. Munich was unrecognizable. Blocks of stone lay like broken bones. Streets vanished into cratered scars. Buildings leaned like charred skeletons. Smoke still lingered in some quarters, the ghosts of fires long extinguished. She breathed the air of home and found it tasted of dust and endings. Her mother's address had been destroyed. No letters had survived. Neighbors were scattered. Entire families gone. She spent weeks searching, walking from one refugee center to another, following fragments of information, rumors, names, scribbled on handwritten lists pinned to church doors. On the 73rd day, she found her. Her mother was thinner, her hair streaked white at the temples, her eyes weary but alive. They embraced with a mixture of relief and grief, each clinging to a world that had barely survived the war. Her mother asked the question all mothers ask returning daughters: "Did anyone hurt you?" And Lieslot answered truthfully, "No, in Texas. They treated us with dignity," but she did not speak of the Turner Ranch, not yet, not until she understood what her own future could hold. The first letter, late one night by the weak light of an oil lamp, Lieslot unfolded a sheet of American Red Cross writing paper. She hesitated before putting pen to page. Every sentence felt like a risk. "Dear Caleb," she began, "I hope this reaches the Turner Ranch if it still stands." She described the ruins of Munich, her search for her mother, the colder world she had returned to, and then at the bottom of the page she wrote, "I do not know what the future holds, but I want you to know that I meant what I said. I will try to find a way back." She folded the letter carefully, addressed it, walked it to a post station running on borrowed power and sheer human will. The clerk told her plainly, many of these letters never make it across, but she sent it anyway. War teaches people not to expect miracles, yet sometimes one arrives anyway. Returned to Texas on a warm afternoon in January 1946, Caleb trudged up the ranch road with a sack of feed over his shoulder. Martha called from the porch, "Caleb, there's a letter for you." He wiped sweat from his brow, surprised. He rarely received letters. When he saw the envelope, his heart jolted. The postmark read, "Munchin U.S." Zone, Germany. He took it from his mother with shaking hands. Inside, Lieslot's words unfolded like a voice carried across miles of ocean. Caleb sat down on the porch steps, the winter sun warm on his back, and read every line twice. A slow smile formed, one his mother had not seen since before his brother's death. Martha watched quietly from behind the screen door. "Is it her?" she asked gently. "Yes. Is she all right?" "She's alive," he said. "And she wants to come back." His mother stepped onto the porch, laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll help her," she said, and she meant it. In the spring of 1946, Caleb filed sponsorship papers. The process was slow, nothing in a post. War world moved quickly, and there were interviews, affidavits, waiting lists. Months passed. Letters traveled back and forth, sometimes taking 6 weeks each way. Yet the thread between them remained unbroken. Her handwriting became a lifeline. His replies became a bridge between continents. And though neither knew it, theirs was not an isolated case. Throughout the United States, especially in the American South, dozens of German POW, men and women, returned to the very farms and ranches where they had once worked under guard. War had brought them unwillingly. Peace brought them back by choice, cultural memory and quiet legacy. By the time the U.S. government eased immigration restrictions in 1947, Lieslot had saved enough working in post-war reconstruction to afford the journey. Her sponsorship was approved. She arrived in Texas that autumn, one civilian among many seeking new beginnings. Historians would later note that the phenomenon repeated itself across the country. Former POW returned not as prisoners, but as spouses' farmhands' neighbors. Americans, but for Caleb and Lyslot, it was never about politics or cultural shifts. It was about a single moment beneath a cottonwood tree, a decision made in the tension between hope and uncertainty. Though theirs is only one story among many, the echoes linger, that sometimes the war that divides nations cannot stop the quiet, stubborn human urge to build new connections, that sometimes compassion creates a future the past could never have predicted, and that in the vast, complicated history of World War II, not all stories end in ruins or grief. Some end with the sound of a screen door opening on a Texas ranch, a woman stepping out into the sunlight, and a man who once met her as a prisoner now welcoming her as the future he had hoped for. By the time the 1950 settled over central Texas, the dust of war had long since blown across the plains and faded into memory. New highways cut across old ranchland. Electric lights spread across towns that once went dark after sunset. Children played where training camps and barbed wire fences had stood less than a decade earlier. Most people who drove the rural roads near here never knew that thousands of prisoners once lived behind those fences. The land had healed quickly, swallowing the past in tall grass and shifting soil. What remained were only fragment stories tucked into local memory photographs, fading in shoeboxes, a few surviving barracks on distant farms used now to store tools or hay. But some stories endured because they did not belong to nations. They belonged to people. One of those stories lived quietly in the Turner Ranch house just outside Hearn, where Lyslot Weber, no longer a prisoner, no longer a refuge, sat on the porch on summer evenings, her hands folded in her lap, watching the red sun sink behind the mesquite trees. Next to her sat Caleb Turner, older, stronger, and still carrying the calm steadiness that had first drawn her toward him beneath the cotton-wood tree years earlier. The war had stripped each of them of something essential, but it had also given them, against all expectation, a new beginning. The world had moved on, but the past still whispered in the rhythm of cicadas and the creak of the porch boards beneath their rocking chairs. The war no one sees sometimes at dusk, when the heat softened and the first stars appeared. Lyslot would think of Camp Hearn as it had been, the barracks washed in moonlight, the smell of dust and laundry soap, women whispering to one another about home, the guarded hope that tomorrow might bring something kinder than the day before. She remembered the fear of not belonging in any world too German for America, too changed for Germany. A woman suspended between two homelands, shattered in different ways. Caleb sensed these thoughts with the intuitive calm of someone who had waited a long time to understand another person's silence. He would simply rest his hand over hers and say, "You're home now." Whatever came before, it brought you here, and she believed him. For Lyslot, the war did not end in 1945. It ended slowly in letters sent across oceans, in paperwork, filled out in cramped offices, in nights spent dreaming of ruins and cotton fields. In the long walk back into herself, the aftermath of war is not measured in treaties or troop movements. It is measured in the quiet rebuilding of human lives, a new country, a new name. When Lyslot became a naturalized U.S. citizen in the early 1950s, she took Caleb's surname Turner, a name rooted in American soil, carrying none of the echoes of political turmoil or national shame she had grown up with. But she kept her first name. "America can have my future," she told Caleb with a small smile. "But my mother gave me my name." They hung a single photograph on the living room wall. Lyslot and her mother, taken during her final visit to Germany in 1952, standing together in a Munich courtyard rebuilt from ashes. Her mother had grown stronger, finding work as a seamstress in a city that rose slowly from dust and rubble. Though she never immigrated to America, she lived long enough to see her daughter's new life take root. "Go where the world is growing," she had told Lancelot. "I will stay where the world must be repaired." The Turner Ranch became a place where two worlds met, old Europe and the new American West. Neighbors noticed Lancelot's accent but treated her with the warmth that life in Texas seemed to cultivate naturally. In time, the accent softened like stones polished by running water, and when she spoke English with a German cadence, children on the ranch listened with wonder, not suspicion. Her past became a story to share, not a wound to hide. A legacy lived quietly by the 1960s. Few remembered the German POW camps scattered across Texas. Even fewer knew that some prisoners, men and women, had returned willingly, drawn by the same generosity that had helped keep them alive during wartime labor. Historians would later document that dozens of former POW married American citizens after the war. Some returned as farmers, others as machinists, and a few like Lancelot as homemakers who built families far from the ruins they were born into. But most of these stories were not written in books or recorded in archives. They lived within families, passed down as gentle recollections. Your grandmother came here during the war. She worked in the fields when the world was falling apart. She chose to stay because she found something kinder. These were the quiet legacies of war, the ones not marked by battle maps or medals, but by love that refused to recognize national boundaries. And though many of these women arrived as prisoners, they remained as something else entirely. Witnesses to the endurance of humanity in the most unlikely places. The cottonwood tree on the edge of the Turner Ranch, the old cottonwood, still stands, the tree that sheltered two people as they spoke truths neither expected to share. Its branches stretch wide, catching the Texas wind like an old ship's sails. Children climb it now. Its leaves scatter across the yard each autumn. Its shadow still falls in the exact place where Lancelot once stood, deciding whether her life would return across the ocean or begin anew in this foreign land. Sometimes, when the breeze rustles its leaves, Lancelot listens with a stillness forged in the hardest years of her youth. To her, the sound carries an echo of that afternoon in 1945, the moment when she understood that captivity does not end at the lifting of barbed wire. It ends when trust replaces fear. Caleb approaches from behind, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "You're thinking of the past again," he says. "Yes," she answers softly, but not with sadness. What the story means: World War II left behind ruins, scars, and empty seats at dinner tables across the world. It taught humanity the depths of cruelty it could reach, and the strength required to rebuild afterward. But it also left behind quieter lessons. That kindness can survive even in wartime. That dignity can be offered even to those labeled as enemies. That compassion shown in a cotton field under the Texas sun can alter the course of two lives. Lancelot and Caleb's story is not extraordinary because it is rare. It is extraordinary because it is human. In the vast machinery of global conflict, where nations collide and histories fracture, the smallest acts, offering water, sharing shade, speaking, gently become the brightest lights in the dark. And sometimes those lights guide a person across oceans, across borders, across the boundaries others draw between us and them. Their story ends not with war, but with peace. Not with loss, but with love. Not with the barbed wire that separated them, but with the open porch where they spent the rest of their lives, watching the Texas horizon, knowing that they had found a home built not from victory or defeat, but from compassion. A war brought them together. Humanity kept them there.